Hi everyone. Today we'll go through quite 5 questions from Radio Navigation, and all of these have been seen in the past month on actual EASA exams across all authorities. So without any further ado, let's jump into the first one. Which of the following statements about the microwave landing system is correct? So the microwave landing system is on the short super high frequency range, or SHF. And knowing this is pretty much enough to answer this particular question. However, there are also quite a few more things that are worth knowing. MLS is a precision approach system that was supposed to overcome the ILS. Unfortunately, it wasn't quick enough when it first started, and the introduction of RNP and RNAV approaches subsequently made it obsolete. However, remember that the MLS was superior to ILS in a way that it allowed for curved approaches, and the obstructions on the ground were not really interfering with the higher frequency range when compared to the ILS, which uses UHF for glide slope and VHF for the localizer. So remember that there are 200 channels. This is the super high frequency range. It allows for curved approaches, and it's essentially a better version of the ILS. Unfortunately, it never caught on. That's why in the world we have only 3 or 4 bigger airports that actually use the MLS system. For question number 2, what will a Mode S transponder reply to? So as any type of transponder, of course, transponders work on an interrogation and response principle, meaning there is an interrogation message sent by the secondary surveillance radar, SSR, and then they reply with a signal. And depending on the transponder mode, they can either give identification, altitude, speed, position, and many more in these more advanced instruments. Of course, SSR is a basic functionality of any transponder, and the Mode S transponder, of course, provides not only identification but also altitude. It can provide altitude in 25 feet increments as compared to Mode C transponder that can only give you increments of 100 feet. And of course, the key here is the TCAS. And of course, the TCAS is something that is directly connected to Mode S transponder, as Mode S is required for the resolution advisories to be given for the aircraft, because it is able to respond to TCAS interrogations, as opposed to Mode Charlie, which is, for example, not. And you may ask why this question is why ADSB is wrong, as this also linked to Mode S transponder. Well, ADSB doesn't respond to or reply to any interrogations, as the B in the ADS stands for broadcast. It just broadcasts the data outside of the aircraft. This is also why, for example, Flightradar is able to get information about aircraft position, as the ADSB is broadcasting information via the satellites to ground stations. Which of the following instrument approach operations are classified as 3D approach operations? So the new classification across the ICAO is Type Alpha and Type Bravo approaches, and then they are divided into 2D and 3D, rather than the old classification of precision and non-precision approaches. Of course, Type Alpha are up to 250 feet the decision height. Type Bravo, which I like to remember them as Type Better because they have lower minima, are below 250 feet decision altitude or decision height, shall I say. And of course, the 3D approaches are the ones which provide lateral and vertical guidance. So for these, of course, the GNSS and Baro VNAV absolutely provide vertical and lateral guidance using the barometric VNAV. This will be most likely LNAV VNAV systems. GLS and precision approach radar both are precision approaches, and both, of course, give us both lateral and vertical navigation. And RNP approaches, they absolutely do. So in RNP approach would be, for example, an NLTV approach. ILS is absolutely a precision approach, a 3D with glide slope and localizer giving us vertical and lateral guidance. And the RNP approach, SBAS, this would be the LPV. as much as required for the LTV approach, which is the localizer performance with vertical guidance. It works kind of like an ILS, giving you lateral deviations, angular deviations rather than lateral, which is seen in LNAV VNAV. So here you can see that the 3D approaches shown here would essentially be um, all of them except for 4. This is my mistake, of course. RNP1, I missed the one there. RNP1 is not an approach, it's a navigation specification. RNP1 is used in the arrival segment, and then for the approach, it switches to RNP 0.3. So I would say that actually all of these will be accurate apart from number 4. And this is correct. And question number 4. The annex shows a multifunctional display. VOR1 is displayed, which has been tuned into the nearby VOR station and correctly identified. The aircraft is. So we have to assess whether the aircraft is going outbound or inbound, whether it's 6 or 3 degrees to the left or right, and on which radial it is currently sitting. So let's look at the HSI. And here we can see the PFD with the HSI below it, and we can see that our aircraft is to the left of the selected radial, which means that we are that the truck is to our right side or the desired radial. And of course, the full-scale deflection is always 10 degrees each side when it comes to the VORs, which means in this case, we are slightly over 5, so 6 in the case of this question, degrees to the left. Now, the question is, are we going inbound or outbound? Of course, here in the middle line, you can see a little arrow pointing forward, which means we are going to the station. We're tracking towards the VOR, and we have selected a radial, which is one with the tail of the needle, 130 approximately. And of course, the radial that we are going towards is always going to be on the opposite side of the arrow. So if the arrow is pointing to, then the radial will be at the tail. If we're going from, then the radial will be in the front. And I just want to say that I can see how this question can be quite confusing because, of course, the radial is always radiating outside of the station. However, in this case, we are not going outbound, we're going inbound. So this should clear this immediately because we are 6 degrees to the left of the inbound course rather than outbound. And this is given away by this little triangle on the HSI. And we're trucking towards the VOR and we're inbound this radial 131 that is selected on the instrument. And now for the last question. When performing an RNP approach, which of the following situations leads to a missed approach unless sufficient visual contact is established? So let's read them one by one. Communications failure. I wouldn't say this leads to a missed approach situation. Comms failure, of course, it's a emergency situation. You need to squawk 7600. However, you will need to land eventually. So if you are already positioned, if you are already doing an approach, you were cleared for the approach, the safest course of action is just to simply continue. And this is what you should do. And also, always when you read the place of an airport, there will most likely be a comms failure procedure, which will require you to simply perform and start a specific approach from the get-go without any specific clearance. So I wouldn't say this constitutes a missed approach situation. TCAS array, always TCAS is never an advisory. It's a compulsory warning that it has to be adhered to. So TCAS, whenever it sounds, you always have to do what it says. If there's traffic, you go around it, always and always. Position fix differs from other instruments. No, you're going to be looking at your GPS. If you have also VOR tuned, for example, it doesn't really matter what it's saying. You're following your primary instrument that is GPS based. The actual navigation accuracy exceeds required. Yes, if you have a requirement for RNP1 and you have 1.5 accuracy, then of course you cannot continue the approach. And lateral deviation exceeds instrument full scale. Well, of course, if it exceeds actually half scale, you're required to go around. So full scale is absolutely correct, making this answer C the correct one. Thank you so much. This is everything. I wish you all the best, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.